All right, what I want to talk about tonight, I want to start getting into the historical reliability of the Scriptures. So I want to spend some time talking on Old Testament reliability, and then maybe next week start talking on New Testament reliability. Problem is, before we can even do that, we have to first establish the possibility of miracles. I don't know if anybody here listened to my debate against Mark Fulton, medical doctor from Australia. One guy listened to it, and it was on the resurrection. And during the cross-examination period, I asked the guy, I said, "You're an atheist, aren't you?" He said, "Yes." And I said, "So you believe miracles are impossible, don't you?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, then why are you taking this debate?" And he didn't even understand what I was getting at, but what I was getting at, and I made the point really clear. We're looking at documents that are supposedly historical documents that are very close to the events that report that a miracle occurred, that Jesus of Nazareth rose from the dead. And you acknowledge that there's no amount of historical evidence or historical testimony that would be enough for you to accept the miracle. And in other words, the guy was admitting no matter how much evidence there is for Jesus' resurrection, he's going to reject it because he thinks miracles are impossible. And that's where we are right now. We've got a lot of guys who are shooting the baloney and pretending that they found some kind of discrepancies in the Gospels or whatever, when in actuality, they just have a bias against miracles, so they're not going to accept any evidence. So in other words, it's not that these guys are looking at the Gospels and saying, "Wait a minute, that's not reliable." These guys already believe miracles are impossible, therefore the Gospels are not historically reliable, can't be trusted, and so we're just going to attack them. But it's not that there's a problem with the historical evidence. These guys have a philosophical bias against miracles before they look at the evidence. And then they decide, I'm not going to accept any evidence for this. So where does that bias come from? It comes from basically two guys. The first one's not in your notes. The great Jewish philosopher. His views about God were somewhat pantheistic. His views were very close to God being the universe, but he believed in a non-personal God.
No.
Yes, good. Thank you very much. And so Benedict Spinoza, and since Spinoza believed in a non-personal God, a God who is a force, he believed that a non-personal God doesn't choose anything. You have to be a personal God to make choices. So God cannot choose to supersede or interrupt the laws of nature. So God didn't choose to create and then create a universe with the laws of nature, like the law of gravity, the laws of thermodynamics and all. God didn't choose to do that. God had to do that. It necessarily flows from God because a non-personal force doesn't make decisions. Electricity is a non-personal force. It doesn't make decisions. The magnetic force is a non-personal force. It does what it has to do. It doesn't choose to do this and choose not to do that. So in Spinoza's way of thinking, okay, he defined miracles. He said miracles are violations of the physical laws of nature. We'll oversimplify it. We'll say, look, dead bodies are supposed to stay dead. They don't come back to life. Somebody dies, they stay dead. Okay? So a miracle, Spinoza would say, would be a violation of the laws of nature. And number two, the laws of nature cannot be violated. Therefore, miracles are impossible. Now, some people will give this argument and say that was from David Hume. But David Hume was not a rationalist like Spinoza. Spinoza believed he could prove everything through reason alone. He was a rationalist. Rationalists use deduction. They argue from the universal to the specific, and they try to find conclusions that are with certainty. So Spinoza thinks he's ruling out the possibility of miracles. David Hume, on the other hand, was an empiricist. He believed that we find truth through the five senses, okay? And so he's going with induction. You look at an individual tree, another tree, and then you try to draw a conclusion about all the trees. But since you haven't empirically studied all of the trees, you haven't observed all the trees, you never know for sure. So all you're dealing there is the realm of probability. So because Spinoza's a rationalist, an ultra-rationalist, he's going to argue miracles are impossible. Hume, because he's an empiricist, he's going to argue miracles are improbable. In fact, so improbable that no wise man would believe in one. Okay? But let's take a look at Spinoza here. Okay, miracles are violations of the physical laws of nature. Okay, why? What we call a miracle is just another word for a supernatural event rather than a natural event. So we define miracles not as violations of the laws of nature, but as a superseding of the laws of nature. And if God's the one who put the laws of nature in motion, then He has the freedom and the power and the ability to supersede those laws anytime He chooses, if He wants to reveal Himself to us. Now you got to understand, if Spinoza is right though, if God is a non-personal force, then the physical laws of nature would be the way things have to be. There's no God to choose when to interrupt or supersede the laws of nature. Okay? He says, point number 2, the laws of nature cannot be violated. Okay? Already we said violated is too strong of a word, but even he said the laws of nature cannot be superseded. Okay? How does he know that? If his view of God, if we could present good evidence that the God who created the universe is actually a personal God, not a non-personal force, and I think we could say, hey, look, morality is not an illusion. It had to come from somewhere. And reason is not an illusion. It had to come from somewhere. Intelligence had to come from somewhere. I think we can argue that the cause of the universe must be moral and rational. Electricity is not moral and rational, but personal beings are moral and rational. So in other words, what I'm saying is, if there's good evidence for the existence of a personal God, Spinoza's argument doesn't even work right there. That's enough to rule it out. But whatever the case, he's assuming what he's supposed to prove. This is called begging the question or arguing in a circle. It's a logical fallacy. See, if the laws of nature cannot be violated, he's supposed to prove miracles are impossible. But he's assuming what he's supposed to prove. Another way of saying the laws of nature cannot be violated is miracles are impossible. The only way you could know that the laws of nature cannot be violated or interrupted or superseded would be if you knew miracles are impossible. So he's begging the question. He's assuming what he's supposed to prove. If the rational, moral, personal God of the Bible exists, then by definition miracles are possible. If a personal God who makes choices created the universe and set in motion the laws of nature, the physical laws of nature, then if He wants to catch our attention, what better way of doing that than by interrupting or superseding the laws of nature? So Spinoza's argument only works if you accept his notion of God, and I think that's a really weak notion. I had a notary come by my house because I was getting my house refinanced, and this guy was right on politically, believed in limited government and rights and all, but then we got to talking about religion. It turns out he's a Buddhist. Doesn't know a whole lot about Buddhism, but he's a Buddhist and lives in Seattle and stuff. But the thing that I kept keying on is that if we are for liberty, then we are defenders of the freedom of persons. But if we came from a God that is not personal, then it seems to me that personhood is an illusion, and there's no basis for liberty. Now, if we were created by a personal God and in His image, then it seems that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are inalienable God-given rights. But if we emanate from a God who is an it, a non-personal force, and we're non-persons, then I don't see where the whole concept of liberty comes from whatsoever. And he didn't have a response for it, so I was able to plant some seed. I gave him a few of my books. I scolded him when I found out his 70-something-year-old mother was waiting in the car. And I said, what about her liberty, dude, Then I found out he was a Chiefs fan, so I'm a former Raider fan, but whatever the case, I think there's a good, solid argument for the existence of a personal, moral, rational God who can choose to interrupt or supersede the laws of nature. A lot of guys want to use Spinoza's argument, a lot of leading philosophers, but very few of them like Spinoza's God. If you're going to trash Spinoza's God, and there's good reasons for trashing Spinoza's God, then you got to trash his argument as well. And but whatever the case, it begs the question. He already, see, in Spinoza's thought, there's not even any fall. There's no place for a fall. There's no place for morality. Everything emanates from God because it had to emanate from God, and it had to emanate from God that way. So the way things are is the way they ought to be, and it's just the way things are. And so for God to say, okay, I'm going to do something a little different here, do a miracle, there's no place for that in his thought. But a lot of guys want Spinoza's impossibility of miracles, but they don't want the kind of God that would entail that. Okay? Now, with David Hume, you get a different type of argument, because David Hume is a deist. He doesn't believe God performs miracles. At the same time, he's an empiricist. He believes that knowledge comes through the world of the senses. And so Hume has a different way to argue, and this is the most widely accepted objection to miracles that philosophers will give you today, will be David Hume's argument. And he argues that wise man only accepts the most probable option. So the wise man only accepts the most probable option. The laws of nature have a high degree of probability. Miracles, I wouldn't put miracles violate the laws of nature for him. I just put miracles are highly improbable. I would cross out number 3 there and change it to miracles are highly improbable. Because, Hume is really contradicting his thought here, because Hume says that just because the sun rise this morning and yesterday morning, and every morning that we've ever remembered in our lives, doesn't mean the sun's going to rise tomorrow. He's using phenomenological language. He understood that the earth revolves around the sun doesn't revolve around the earth. But just what we call sunrise, he said, just because our senses have perceived the sun rising all the days of our lives, doesn't mean that tomorrow morning the sun's going to rise. We have no way of really proving that. What he's basically showing is the fallacy of induction. When you argue from the particular to the whole, okay, let's say we got to examine all the blue chairs in this room. Okay, so we examined all the blue chairs in this room, and we found that all the blue chairs were blue. And so we said, okay, well, therefore all the chairs in this room are blue. But what do you do when you have a stool that is also a form of a chair and it's not blue? So the only way you can know all the chairs in this room are blue is if you examine all the chairs. The problem is we haven't examined every morning. How do we know what tomorrow morning's going to be like? How do we know what the morning's going to be like 50 years from now? How do we know what the morning was like 1,000 years before we were born? Okay? So empiricism is very tentative, so it's really weird that out of one side of his empirical mouth, David Hume will act like the laws of nature, we got a hold of them tentatively, because what we've observed, we haven't observed everything. Then out of the other side of his mouth, he acts almost like Spinoza, to where he uses the laws of nature in such a way that the wise man is going to see, you apply this to his other thought, the wise man would say, well, the laws of nature have such a high degree of probability that the sun will probably rise tomorrow, to such a degree that I'm going to say the sun is definitely going to rise tomorrow. On Monday, Hume says, no, you can't say that. But then on Tuesday, to argue against miracles, he said, yeah, the wise man's always going to say that. So there's kind of a tension in his thought. But he says miracles are highly improbable, yet the laws of nature have a high degree of probability. Therefore, the wise man will always reject miracles. Okay? Now, look at this for a minute. Okay? The wise man only accepts the most probable option. I don't know. Is that really true? I mean, the Colts beat the Broncos today in Denver. Most of the experts said that's not going to happen. Andrew Luck is just not there yet. His team is just not there yet. And the Broncos are where they need to be, and Peyton Manning's going to get it done. And if somebody said, how many points did the Broncos score today? Something like 17, maybe? They scored, they had 13 points. 13 points, one touchdown.
Yeah.
And that was early in the game. So Peyton Manning went for about 3.5 quarters without scoring a touchdown. How improbable is that? And a playoff game in Denver? That's highly improbable. So, I mean, if you take some of the ESPN's greatest sports analysts, if one of them was in a coma and they just brought him out of the coma and told him that the Broncos lost and in Denver only scored 13 points, he's going to say, I don't believe it. That's just not probable. I just don't believe it. I think you're messing with me. And then after he reads the newspaper, he realizes, wow, I was wrong. So, maybe if the wise man only accepts the most probable option, well, then the wise man is wrong sometimes. Okay? The most probable thing, based on human thought, based on the thought of wise men doesn't always come out. You have upsets all the time in sports. Okay? Now, the laws of nature have a high degree of probability, of course. Who's going to deny that? I mean, a miracle wouldn't even be noticed if it wasn't for the laws of nature being so regular that that's what we expect pretty much all the time. Richard Dawkins acts like the apostles says they're pre-scientific. Okay? If they knew about what Richard Dawkins knows about science, they would never believe Jesus wasn't dead. Look, let me tell you something. Because they saw Jesus alive after his death, that's why they worshipped him as God and trusted in him for salvation. If they were pre-scientific, like Richard Dawkins claims, they would think, well, I've heard stories of everybody and their mother's brother rising from the dead. So when Jesus rises from the dead, they'd say, no big deal. I believe in all this superstitious stuff. But the fact that the apostles saw Jesus risen from the dead means that they believe, look, the laws of nature have a high degree of probability. Jesus died. He's supposed to stay dead. He didn't stay dead. I think all those things he taught us are true. And Doubting Thomas is like, look, I've trusted you guys before. I know you guys. But you're telling me he's alive. Dead bodies stay dead. Laws of nature have a high degree of probability. I won't believe unless I see him myself. And I'm able to put my fingers in his wounds. He sees Jesus 8 days later alive. He says, my Lord and my God. Okay? The reason why he acknowledged Jesus as his Lord and his God is because the laws of nature have a high degree of probability. Yet the laws of nature were superseded, and Jesus of Nazareth came back from the dead. Miracles are highly improbable. You bet they're highly improbable. If God did them all the time, we'd never be able to. If God did miracles all the time, we would think they're just laws of nature. Okay? So, you can look at this and say, look, wise man only accepts the most common events. No. Laws of nature are the most common events. Miracles are very uncommon. Therefore, the wise man will always reject miracles. That doesn't make sense. You could say, the wise man only accepts the most common event. The laws of nature are the most common events. Unusual events are very uncommon. Therefore, the wise man will always reject unusual events. No! Napoleon's whole military career was unusual. Yet you're an idiot if you deny what happened to him. So unusual events do occur. They're unusual, but they do occur. And it's the same with miracles. So this doesn't hold water. Another one of his arguments is, so basically, look, the laws of nature have a high degree of probability, miracles are highly improbable. However, the wise man will still accept, and he's kind of equivocating on probability here too, because the laws of nature happen more commonly. So in that sense, they're more probable. It's much more likely that this day, from here, 7:47 at night till the end of the day, that we're going to go without any miracles. That's much more probable than that a miracle occurs. Okay? At the same time, that doesn't mean that the wise man will therefore never believe in miracles. If you have good, solid eyewitness testimony. By the way, another one of David Hume's arguments against miracles, he pretty much shows his ethnocentrism. He pretty much argues the guy's got to be kind of like him. Well-educated Western philosopher before he would accept their testimony that a miracle has occurred. So it's almost like saying, I won't accept that a miracle occurred unless well-educated atheists like Richard Dawkins tell me that a miracle occurred. Well, it's not going to happen. But basically, then he talks about the people of biblical times as if they were a bunch of uneducated ignoramuses. Okay? Look, you've got solid eyewitness testimony from people sincere enough to die for their beliefs that they had seen Jesus risen from the dead. That's good enough evidence for wise men to believe that Jesus rose from the dead, which is why so many wise men throughout the history of Western civilization, most of the wise men throughout the history of Western civilization believed in Jesus' resurrection. Okay? I mean, it was to a point where all the universities were Christian universities. And, you look at Galileo and the debates there. Well, Galileo was a Bible-believing Christian. Pascal was a Bible-believing Christian. Newton was a Bible-believing Christian. The list goes on and on. So another one of his arguments is I'll only accept it if the eyewitnesses are basically the most brilliant guys in academic circles. Based on that, we would never convict a guy of a crime unless there were, 14 PhDs who witnessed it. So that doesn't make sense. He also says there's miracle claims in all different religions, and all these religions contradict each other, so they cancel each other out. Okay? That'd be like saying, because I have found 4 different types of counterfeit money, all money is counterfeit. Okay? I would argue if you find counterfeit miracles, there's probably true miracles. Okay? And why counterfeit something if there's no evidence that the real thing is out there? And so David Hume's argument doesn't hold. See, the thing is, what he's doing, he's taking kind of like general knowledge and philosophy, okay? And he's imposing the way you find truth there on history. And he's saying, look, we only believe the most probable. Well, who determines what is the most probable? Okay? And then he's saying that's the way we should do our history. No, history tries to find early eyewitness testimony. That's the best stuff. And if you can get multiple witnesses, multiple attestation, and maybe even if the enemies admit that the believers believe they saw him, so you get enemy attestation, you get some embarrassing details. It's very embarrassing for the apostles to admit that they didn't believe that women were the first witnesses. In the male chauvinistic society, women were the first witnesses of the empty tomb and the risen Christ, and the apostles, even Peter and John, 2 of the 3 pillars of the Jerusalem church, they didn't believe it. Even when they found the empty tomb, it took seeing Jesus risen from the dead for at least Peter to believe that he rose from the dead. The Jews tried to explain away the resurrection in the Talmud. So this was being taught by the early church. Multiple attestation. We get 4 different accounts of Jesus' resurrection. And so what do? They try to claim that 2 of them stole the account from one, and then just the other 2 accounts aren't good enough for them. They say that Matthew and Luke borrowed from Mark, which I don't think is the case. This early eyewitness testimony. So you got everything that you need to determine good, solid, historical fact. And Hume is saying, no, based on our philosophical biases, that miracles are not probable. Look, before the debate even starts whether miracles occur, both sides are going to acknowledge that miracles are not the most probable. So the issue is not, Hume wants us to look at all human history and determine probability based on that. That's not what the historian does. The historian looks at one supposed historical event and then determines the probability based on this. Okay? You realize that most guys that become New Testament scholars, they're not Bible-believing Christians. Some are, very few. But if you want to study the Bible and you're a Bible-believing Christian, you probably want to be a pastor and you get an MDiv degree, a Master of Divinity degree. But if you want to go and get a PhD in New Testament studies, it's probably because you're not a believer and you want to attack the Scriptures. Having said that, over 70% of New Testament scholars believe that Jesus of Nazareth, because of the evidence, because of this, that Jesus of Nazareth rose from the dead in some way, shape, or form. Not all hold to a bodily resurrection, which is what the Bible teaches. But basically what they're looking at is, and by the way, the other 30% that don't believe Jesus bodily rose from the dead, they acknowledge enough historical data to say, it seems to indicate that he rose from the dead, but I don't believe, I'm biased against miracles for philosophical reasons, so I don't believe he rose from the dead, so I don't know what happened. All the other alternative theories have been refuted by the non-Christian scholars themselves. Swoon theory that he passed out and was revived in the tomb, the stolen body theory, all these, the hallucination theory. And so usually, if they reject, the New Testament scholar rejects all this evidence, he acknowledges, well, it does seem to point to a resurrection, but I don't believe in resurrections. So what Hume's doing is like a category mistake. He's saying, look, miracles are so improbable when you look at all recorded human history. Therefore, the wise man will never accept that a miracle occurred. That's not the way you do history. The way you do history, you get some sources saying that one supposed historical miraculous event occurred. Well, what's the evidence for or against that? And that's how you determine whether the resurrection or some other miracle is probable, not by dictating what can or cannot happen because of your philosophy. Okay? So anybody have any questions about Spinoza or Hume? Basically, you could just simplify the whole thing by saying, if God, and by God I mean the theistic God, a personal God, if a personal God exists, miracles are possible. Now, how do you know? So in other words, if the theistic God exists, if a personal creator God exists, he's able to do miracles. Miracles are possible. Well, did any miracles occur? Well, to do that, now what we have to do is look at the evidence, the testimonies that those miracles occurred. Okay? And I think when you look at the biblical accounts, the most reasonable response is that these highly improbable, these philosophically highly improbable events did actually occur. By the way, if Jesus' life and actions were not improbable, would anybody believe he was God? You know, if he just lived a common life, why would anybody believe he's God? So, so that opens the door for us. Now, we've established, look, if God exists, and we provided really good evidence that he does exist, then what we can do at this point is try to determine, okay, well then is the Bible historically reliable? So what I want to do is spend the rest of tonight talking about Old Testament reliability, and then after that we'll move on to the reliability of the New Testament manuscripts. Okay? And with the New Testament we'll get into much more detail than with the Old Testament. We'll talk about the canon of Scripture. How do we know that we got the 27 New Testament books right? What about the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Mary? Why weren't those books included? There's good reasons why those books were not included. What about the New Testament text? Bart Ehrman says we have no idea what the New Testament actually said because we got so many different variants, so many different discrepancies in the copies. Well, we'll address that. How do we know the New Testament manuscripts are reliable? And how do we know that the history that it reports is historically accurate? So we'll be looking at that. But right now I want to look at Old Testament reliability. So if you go back to the beginning of your book and then just look for page AP 19. AP 19. Here's Old Testament reliability. It's a lot harder to establish Old Testament reliability than New Testament reliability because apparently a copy of it, and they were so meticulous in copying it that they considered the newer copy just as reliable as the older copy, just as accurate as the older copy, and then so that they would not want it to fall apart, out of respect, they would kind of have a little manuscript burning ceremony. Kind of like the way we dispose of the American flag. You're not supposed to just throw it in your garbage can. You're supposed to, in a respectful way, burn it, not a public burning like you hate America or whatever. But you're supposed to burn it rather than kind of like cremation, rather than just take the American flag and say, well, this is ripped, so just throw it in the ground. You're not really supposed to allow the American flag to touch the ground. And so because of this, we don't have a whole lot of ancient Hebrew manuscripts. In fact, most of our Old Testament comes from about 1010 AD, the Masoretic text, which is the entire Old Testament, the standard text today. That's the text that the Jews use. So they have copies from about 1010 AD. So 1010 AD. That's the Masoretic text. Okay. For a long time, that was the oldest Hebrew that we have. Guess what? We got a problem here because some of the Old Testament goes back to somewhere between 2000 to 1500 BC. Okay? So you got like as much as 3,000, like the book of Job. If that was written in 2000 BC, you got the standard Hebrew text 3,000 years later. There could have been a lot of corruptions of it, perversions of it in between that time. Okay? Now what we do have about 200 BC, we have the Greek Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament that dates back to about 200 years before Jesus walked the earth. Okay? So we can compare this with this. Okay? But then in the Dead Sea Scrolls, what was that, the 1940s when they discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls? And date back to about 150 BC. These are the oldest Hebrew manuscripts of the Old Testament and other Hebrew writings that we've ever found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And when we compare, like they compared Isaiah here with Isaiah here, and they found pretty much a perfect match. Okay? So, manuscript evidence is not quite as good as the New Testament because of the Jewish practice of destroying the older manuscripts so they don't get left around. We just lucked out with the Dead Sea Scrolls. But we have enough to go on to show that over a 1,000-year period, there wasn't enough change to where we would lose faith in this being accurate. Now, having said that, where the Greek Septuagint differs from the Hebrew text over here, there's a lot of times where I favor the Greek Septuagint. A lot of scholars would have a hard time with me, but I'm telling you, when the author of Hebrews quotes messianic passages from the Greek Septuagint, they match up perfectly with the Old Testament passages. Well, when he quotes from the Greek Septuagint, and you'll see sometimes a New Testament quotation of an Old Testament passage, and they don't match. Okay, like, it is written about me in the scroll, a body you have prepared for me. When he sends his son into the world, he says, a body you have prepared for me, it is written about me in the scroll. Obviously talking about Jesus. You go back to the passage that the author of Hebrews is quoting, and it says, when he sends his son into the world, he says, my ears you have pierced, and it is written about me in the scroll. So, and Justin Martyr did accuse, in his dialogue with Trypho, did accuse the Jews. 150 AD, he was accusing the Jews. He's saying, you know as well as I do, you've changed some of the messianic passages because they so clearly point to Jesus. So there's a few times where the Greek Septuagint translation of the Old Testament is what's being quoted in the New Testament, or it could be an older Hebrew manuscript that agrees with the Greek Septuagint, but not the Masoretic text. And but for the most part, the agreement is strong enough for us to see the reliability there. But the most effective way to argue, what in the world is that? The most effective way to argue for the reliability of the Old Testament is actually to go into particular passages and say, okay, why do the liberals reject this as being historical? And now here's some good reasons to show that the liberals are wrong and we're right, to embrace them as historical. Now before we move on, we just have to give several definitions here. They're in your notes on AP 19 of your Advanced Apologetics lecture note booklet. And lower criticism is just, you see with lower criticism and higher criticism, lower just means it's like more basic, okay? And so with lower criticism, okay, what you're doing there is just trying to restore the original text on the basis of imperfect copies. So that's textual criticism, okay? So let's say you have 1,000 copies of one passage in Mark's Gospel, and out of those 1,000 copies, 999 of them say that Jesus had compassion on a guy, and so he healed him. And just one of the copies said Jesus was angry, and so he healed the guy. Okay? Well, textual criticism will say, well, we got that many copies saying this, and the one copy that differs isn't older than these, then this copy has probably got it wrong. So that's all textual criticism. You buy a Greek New Testament, at the bottom they'll tell you all the different variants, and you could buy books to find out why they chose this. I mean, there's some real questions. Do the last 9 verses or so of Matthew's Gospel, of Mark's Gospel, they're not in the oldest manuscripts. Should we remove them? They're in the majority of the manuscripts, but not the oldest ones. John 7:53 to 8:11, Jesus forgiving the woman caught in adultery. That's not in the oldest manuscripts. It's in the majority of the manuscripts, but it's not in the oldest ones. That's one of the reasons why I preach from the New King James. I like the majority of the manuscripts. I think they got to be the majority because they passed the test of time. Whereas some of these older ones may still exist because they were never considered real reliable copies, even as old as they were. That's all textual criticism. So even evangelicals have to do that. Okay? But higher criticism, evangelicals do higher criticism, but it deals with the authorship, the date, and the integrity of each book. Authorship, date, who are the readers, and the integrity of each book. Okay? So, like for instance, for the book of Hebrews, the evangelical scholars will say, well, nowhere does the author state his name like Paul does in his 13 letters. So that's why you like debated Doug Kruger, atheists supposed to study the Bible thoroughly on the resurrection. And you say, well, evangelicals admit now that Paul didn't even write Hebrews. I said, yeah, well, they never really claimed that he did. I mean, some believe he did, but I think the evidence is pretty good that he didn't. And he said, well, and he started pressing the point. And then eventually I realized he thought that Hebrews starts out, Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to the Hebrews or whatever. And I said, no. I said, you need to read it again. Paul's name is not even mentioned in the book of Hebrews, let alone in the greeting. And then he got embarrassed when he found out it wasn't. So how thoroughly do you read the book when you think it, by the way, question people when they object to the scriptures. I had a graduate at Penn State, talked about it in earlier lectures, telling me that the Bible's got contradictions. I said, oh good, name one. He said, well, there's so many, I can't think of one right now. I said, what languages was the Bible originally written in? And he said, wasn't it Latin? I said, no. I said, dude, do me a favor. Don't even talk about a book you ain't even read. Okay? You don't even know what you're talking about. You don't even know the original languages it was written in. And but sometimes call these people's bluff because they'll say, oh yeah, I read the Bible numerous times. You know what that's code for? That's code for I went online. That's code for I want to sleep with my girlfriend. I know the Bible condemns it. Never really read the Bible. Grew up in a nominally Christian home, and I read somewhere on the internet that the Bible has contradictions. Okay? And so the guy will act like, yeah, I consider myself somewhat of a biblical scholar. Yeah, because you went to Internet Infidels, an atheist website, and you read a few things they said about a book that you ain't never read. Boy, scholarship like that, who needs ignoramuses? But whatever the case, but we can look at this like when you say, well, Paul's the author, the readers are the Colossian believers, but we can say, well, why is he writing to these readers? I want to learn more about these readers. Well, you can study the book and you can figure it out. You can figure out from clues, the date when each of the books were written and stuff. But see, what the liberal critics will do, they'll attack the traditional authors. Now, it's amazing that they still accept 7 of Paul's letters. They wish they could throw out all 13, but there's 7 of them that they just can't deny it. He wrote Romans, he wrote 1st and 2nd Corinthians, he wrote 1st Thessalonians, he wrote Philippians, Philemon, and Galatians. They can't deny it. You can build a powerful case for the resurrection on that alone, just what they give you. And but with their higher criticism, they're going to throw out the other 6 for less than good reasons. Like say, 1st and 2nd Timothy had to be written much later because it talks about Gnosticism. No, it doesn't. It doesn't talk about full-blown mid-2nd century Gnosticism. They'll also say that in 1st, 2nd Timothy and in Titus, the church is so, the setup of the church is just so formal that this didn't occur to the 2nd century A.D. What do you talk? All they had was elders and deacons. Look at the synagogues of Paul's day and earlier. They had pretty much the same setup, elders and deacons. By the way, that's why we date some of the apostolic fathers' writings, who came later than the apostles. That's why we date some of them much later. Like the teaching of the 12 apostles, we date that much later because it has the same church political structure, if you will, same church government as 1st and 2nd Timothy, which the liberal scholars say Paul didn't write and were written much later. Well, Paul did write them and they were written in the 60s A.D. Maybe the teaching of the 12 apostles was written in the 60s A.D. If that's the case, you liberals better start sweating, because he quotes a lot from Matthew's Gospel in there. Okay? That's why read my book, Hijack Historical Jesus, because, believe it, I say things in that book that most of our most conservative seminaries aren't ready to say. Because you gotta question the authority of New Testament scholars, especially when most of them are not true believers. And if we're just going to accept everything they teach us, we might as well just throw traditional Christianity out the window. But lower criticism, textual criticism of which of these manuscripts, which represents what the original actually said. You have to do that before you can do a translation of the Bible. Higher criticism would be, well, do you really believe Paul wrote Ephesians? Who do you think wrote the book of Hebrews? That's a big debate about that. Do you think the Apostle John wrote 1st, 2nd, 3rd John and Revelation and the Gospel of John? Or maybe he only wrote the Gospel of John and a later disciple named John wrote the rest. Okay? But the liberals will take higher criticism to the point where it's nothing but attacks on the traditional authorship and traditional dates of the New Testament books. I mean, there was a time when liberal critics were saying around the time of Benedict Spinoza and afterwards that, yeah, all the New Testament books were probably written hundreds of years after the fact. Well, now we have manuscript copies, fragments, that go so far back, nobody's saying that anymore. So like the Jesus Seminar, Marcus Borger, the Jesus Seminar, an anti-Christian scholar at Oregon State University, and he'll acknowledge that every New Testament book was written somewhere between, the entire New Testament was written somewhere between 50 A.D. with Paul's earliest writings and about 110 or 115 A.D. Okay, so basically, the most liberal of the Jesus Seminar would say the New Testament between 50 A.D. and 110 A.D. Most evangelical scholars are going to say between 50 A.D. and 95 A.D. Look, see, there's not much difference. Then you get a guy like Phil Fernandes who's willing to question these critics further. And, you know, because the New Testament, liberal New Testament critics will only accept, they will only accept the latest possible dates. They never ask the question, well, what's the earliest possible date? And when you look at the earliest possible dates, they really coincide with what the early church fathers told us about the New Testament. And so I'm willing to, if we assume that Jesus was crucified in 33 A.D., I'm willing to date the New Testament books from 35 A.D. to 70 A.D. with the possibility that there may have been some written about 85 A.D. But I'm open to the possibility it might have been even earlier, that all 27 books may have been written for. I think Matthew's Gospel was written within a couple of years of the crucifixion. I don't see any reason why it couldn't be. And but read my book, Hijacking the Historical Jesus, Redating the New Testament. And okay, now form criticism, is based on speculation. It seeks to find the supposed oral traditions that lie behind the written documents. So it's kind of like evolution was real popular back then, and so everything had to be kind of evolve into existence. Henry Thiessen says that's why Mark was considered to be the first gospel written. One of the reasons why it was the shortest of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and so it evolved and got bigger, you know. And so with form criticism, they believe here you have the crucifixion, okay, approximately about 30 A.D. Then you have oral teachings and oral tradition. That's probably in the 30s and 40s A.D. And then eventually you have the New Testament being written between 50 and 110 A.D. But there's this assumption that there was a period where there were no books written, just oral teachings. I question that. I disagree with Michael Kona, a good friend of mine, but I think he's wrong. I don't think the Gospels were Greco-Roman literature. I don't think, what indeed has the church to do with Athens? What indeed has Jerusalem to do with Athens? The early church was Jewish. And the Jews, their most authoritative thing in Judaism was the written Old Testament. And if Jesus is the fulfillment of the Old Testament, it only makes sense that they would have had the incentive to put that into writing earlier rather than later. Okay? I mean, we got to the point where one of my favorite evangelical, Bible-believing Christian New Testament scholars, Ben Witherington III, believes Matthew's Gospel was written by some unknown guy about in the 80s A.D. Why would you believe it? All the church fathers that talked about Matthew's Gospel told us Matthew wrote it, and he wrote it before any of the other Gospels were written. And so form criticism is an assumption that there's a period of oral writings. Okay? You get form criticism. There was a period of oral teaching before any of the New Testament was written. And then these guys like to say, because now there's so much evidence that the New Testament we have today was exactly the New Testament that they wrote. And so they say, well, yeah, well, if the writing didn't occur until 20 to 50 or 60 years later, maybe like the telephone game, this oral tradition, the truth, got stretched, and so what was written down wasn't really accurate. Now, what I will say is this. There is an element of truth to this. And what that is, though, it's not what these guys wanted. It's the ancient creeds or hymns found in the New Testament. Like 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8, which lists the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. And it lists the original gospel preached. That Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures. That He was buried. That He raised from the dead on the third day according to the Scriptures. And that He appeared. And then He gives a summary list of His appearances. Romans 10:9. If you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart God raised Him from the dead, you will be saved. They believe that was an original baptismal formula. So there's actually evidence of ancient creeds where the vocabulary is different from the author. the rest of the letter, and it's very poetic if you translate it back into Hebrew or Aramaic. And so their ancient creeds or hymns recited or sung in the early church before the New Testament was even written. But this stuff teaches exactly what the liberal scholars want to be lost by the time we get to the year. So the original gospel and what we got in the New Testament is one and the same. And I would also say that you should allow for something like Matthew being written this early. In fact, I would even argue, I argue for Matthew about 35 AD, at least in, I believe Papias was originally written in Hebrew, and then later translated to Greek. And then Mark, I actually think it was after Peter left Rome the first time, so about 45 AD. I think we can make a case, Luke, 45 to 50 AD. And John's Gospel, I agree with Princeton scholar, I can't even remember his name now. Princeton scholar wrote Jesus Within Judaism. What was his name? Anyway, Princeton scholar who argues that the theological thought forms of John's Gospel put it between early to mid-50s AD. Now, I can guarantee you 19 out of every 20 pastors in Kitsap County is probably going to date Matthew about 60s AD, Mark 60s AD, Luke probably 60s AD, and John about 90 AD. Okay, I think the arguments for all that are kind of weak, but I think it's just that they're so influenced by New Testament scholarship. I mean, it's like when Frank Turek interviewed me, and I was talking about Clement of Rome and what he had to say, the Apostolic Father. And he said that Clement of Rome, for in case our listeners don't know, he wrote in 95 AD when he was the Bishop of Rome. And I didn't want to correct Frank, but that's what professors teach in our seminaries. But I said, yeah, but he became the Bishop of Rome in the 90s AD. But that didn't mean he wrote his letter in the 90s AD. He could have written his letter earlier than the 90s AD, and then when he became the Bishop of Rome, because he became the Bishop of Rome, they decided to make some copies of the letter he had written decades earlier. And since Clement of Rome, in his letter to the Corinthians, he says the temple is still standing in Jerusalem, that means the latest it could have been written was early 70 AD. Okay? And Frank's a great guy. Frank's a great defender of the faith. But the problem is that we only accept what our professors teach us, even though they're evangelicals. Most of these evangelical New Testament scholars were trained by non-believing liberal New Testament scholars. So the question isn't just when's the latest dates that these were, so we basically, our pastors and our apologists accept the earliest dates that the liberal scholars will allow. But the liberal scholars are only looking for the latest possible dates. If we look at the earliest possible dates, you can make a case for much earlier than that. But I really encourage you to read that chapter. But Reformed criticism, it was an attempt to destroy what was written in here, was written in the New Testament, based on what they thought was taught here. But in the New Testament, we found evidence of the oral tradition, and it's the same stuff that is written about there. That Jesus is God, He is Savior, He is Messiah, He died on the cross for our sins, bodily rose from the dead on the third day and appeared to His disciples, proving He had risen from the dead. Okay, so that's form criticism. Now the documentary hypothesis, this is what we're going to spend the bulk of our time next week refuting. The documentary hypothesis is the theory that the Pentateuch, the Pentateuch is the first 5 books of the Bible, the Law of Moses, okay? Penta means 5. So the Pentateuch is the theory that the Pentateuch was not written by Moses. It was a compilation of different written documents composed by different authors at different places and different times long after Moses. Okay? See, if you're going to acknowledge that Moses did write it, and Moses did live way back then you're probably going to have to give that this is some accurate stuff. Okay? And so that's what the documentary hypothesis is. Now let me say this. No leading biblical scholar believes in the documentary hypothesis anymore. Okay? Documentary hypothesis basically says there's four main sources for the first five books of the Bible, four different sources. Nobody believes that anymore. Now, instead of saying, okay, we need to go back to Mosaic authorship, they end up inventing more and more sources. Okay? So, you could read my doctoral dissertation, and if you want, you could probably say, yeah, it was written by 7 different guys. No, it wasn't written by 7 different guys. It's got 8 different parts to it, 8 different sections. And it might sound a little different when I'm writing on testimonial apologetics than when I'm writing on philosophical apologetics, but it's the same author. But anybody can do that. You can act like you're some kind of genius, and if everybody else had the training that you had, you could see real easily that these were written by different guys. And by the way, the ancient Jews were so primitive, they could only have one name for their primary deity. So when they called him Yahweh, that's one author. When they called him Elohim, that must be a different author. So when you get verses in the Pentateuch that call God the Lord God, Yahweh Elohim, that took 2 different authors at 2 different times and 2 different places to complete that verse. Yeah. And so what these guys say, because there's so much unity, and they got all these different sources, they end up saying, well, there had to be some redactor, some editor who later came on and brought it all together. And so we'll attack that, the documentary hypothesis next week. The main thing we need to understand is that the common liberal bias is atheistic evolution, that revelation from God, prophecy from God, miracles performed by God, they're all impossible. And then they assume that polytheism, worship of many gods, evolved into monotheism. Even though Wilhelm Schmidt's work, Catholic missionary and anthropologist, has proven otherwise, that when you talk to the primitive cultures, that might be animistic, believe all nature is animated by spirits, or might be polytheistic, believing in many gods. You talk to them and they say, oh yeah, our ancestors believed in one creator God. We forgot his name, we forgot how to worship him, and we're really afraid of the lesser gods. So we worship them and sacrifice to them right now. In other words, started out original monotheism, like Cain and Abel. Abel's sacrifice, and then devolved into polytheism rather than the other way around. So it's that bias against miracles that just messes with the work. Now just look down at the bottom of the page there on the documentary hypothesis. Final guy, Julius Bellhausen. And by the way, this is what led, you want to know what led to Nazism? The Germans, theologians and biblical scholars led. They were the first to question the Mosaic authorship of the first 5 books of the Bible. They were the first to question if the Bible was God's Word and question the historical accuracy. And so when they trained pastors of the German church, less and less of those pastors believed. And the void that filled a church which lost its believing pulpit, the void that filled that was Nazism, which was a blending of ancient German mythology with the occultic teachings of the Theosophical Society. German branch was called the Thule Society. So what led to Adolf Hitler and the rise of the Nazis was the apostasy of the German church leadership. Okay? But whatever the case, Wellhausen supported the JEDP thing. So you just turn the page, you see J was the Jehovah, or the Yahwist. They believe wrote in 850 BC. The Elohim portions of the Pentateuch were written about 750 BC. Deuteronomy, that's the legal code. They think the legal code was way too advanced for 1450 BC. That was before we found the Hittite legal code, which is just as advanced and goes back even further. But that was probably written 621 BC. And then the priestly code, like Leviticus, is too advanced for 1450 BC, must have been written 570 to 530 BC. Well, we're going to refute the documentary hypothesis and argue that Moses did write the first 5 books of the Bible. Then we'll talk a little bit about Joshua, Isaiah, and the book of Daniel. And because these are the biggest attacks on the Old Testament books. So that's all about all we have time for tonight. But we'll pick it up there and next week and provide some evidence for the historical reliability of the Old Testament. God bless you, everybody.